Now, 8 years after the United States renamed its Pacific Command as the Indo-Pacific Command, Washington has now reverted to the original name. The Department of War says that the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command will officially be restored as the U.S. Pacific Command, and the command was originally established on 1st January 1947 under President Harry Truman. For more than 70 years, it operated as USPACOM, becoming the oldest and largest unified combatant command of the United States. The 2018 renaming to Indo-Pacific Command was widely seen as a strategic signal. It reflected the growing importance of India and the increasing connectivity between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean in American defense planning. And at that time, then U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis had said that partnerships across the Pacific and Indian Oceans were critical for regional stability. Now, the return to Pacific Command raises questions about whether Washington is recalibrating its strategic messaging. Now, despite the name change, Washington says that the command's mission will remain unchanged. The area of responsibility will still stretch from the waters of the U.S. West Coast to the western border of India. And the Department of War says that its commitment to maintaining a free and open theater with regional allies and partners remain intact. So while the name goes back to Pacific Command, the strategic footprint still reaches deep into the Indian Ocean region. And my colleague Deepak is joining me right now to get us more details. Deepak, what must have been the compulsion for U.S. to rename its Pacific Command as the Indo-Pacific Command back to being called Pacific Command alone? Initially, when it was decided in 2018, it went on to show that there is some serious calibration when it comes to the U.S. and the Indian authorities when it comes to strategic defense, policies ahead. But now with this change, going back to how it was earlier, what does it talk? Does it mean that U.S. is now trying to recalibrate?
That's right, Samia. You know, the timing is very, very important. At a time when Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump are at the G7 summit, Washington is sending out very, very, subtle signals that now India is no longer central to its, strategy against China. Because earlier in 2018, when it was renamed as Indo-Pacific, that time US had made it amply very clear that India was very, very central to its counter against China. And they also, made it clear that Pacific and the Indian Oceans cannot be treated separately. And that's why they had a framework put in place there so that the US, wanted to send out a message saying that it is cooperating with more regional partners like India, Japan and Australia. But now, looking at the recent move of the Washington, D.C., it looks like this is more than just nostalgia. It's not nostalgia that they wanted to, bring back the Pacific Command, but it's also a very, very important signaling. Because if you look at how the US has been behaving with India over the last 1 year, you can see the signs are already there, and they were always there. First came the tariffs, then came, US's narrative on India fueling Ukraine's war by buying Russia's oil. But India had always made it very, very clear that their interests are very, very important and they wouldn't budge. But now, looking at the recent developments, US is, recalibrating its strategy in the Pacific Ocean, and it's moving away from India as well. Because the signaling is very, very clear, Samya, that US has now put its emphasis back on the Pacific first approach. But now, US claims that, their theater and the missions will, go as usual, will remain status quo. This Pacific, ocean that we're seeing stretches from US West Coast to the western borders of India. But the real challenge lies in the, technology transfer, the trade, defense strategies, and also, innovation as far as both the bilateral engagement is concerned in the Indo-Pacific region. But now all of that will be put to test because Washington has renamed it back from Indo-Pacific Command to Pacific Command, which is a very, very subtle but a clear signaling that India is no longer center to US's strategy against China.